You see, cowboys, they weren't pretty, they weren't neat, and they damn sure weren't polished. They didn't sit on plush couches watching westerns and sipping whiskey talking about how the West was won. No, they lived the grit, they lived the grind, and they lived on the raw edges of the stories that they would tell later in their lives. You see, their lives weren't romanticized in sepia tones and the gallant hero riding off into the sunset. That's not what cowboys really were. Their lives were dust-streaked and sweat-soaked. They were full of hard days and harder truths that they had to live. Real cowboys lived in the moment, with little care for the gilded movie screen or the streaming service that would eventually try to portray them for something in the modern world in 2024. But for some of them, like an old boy I knew named Gerald, it wasn't a life. Being a cowboy wasn't a life. It was the only way of being. No, Gerald was a cowboy. At least that's what they called him, was Gerald. Nobody knew if that was his real name or if it was just one that he picked up somewhere along the lines that stuck with him for convenience. Old Gerald was tall and lanky. He was the kind of fella who looked like the wind itself could blow him away. He had to drink a cup of coffee to keep on a summer's day, he had to drink a cup of coffee to keep his pants up on his hips. But somehow, old Gerald stood sturdy, like a fence post. Yeah, like a fence post in a thunderstorm. And his belt seemed to be more of a formality than a necessity. He once joked that in the summer heat he had to drink that cup of coffee just to keep his pants up, like I say. Yeah, Gerald was a master of an art that I call the art of bullshit. He could spin a story like a spider. Yeah, fine and delicate, but also with enough strength to hold you in its place. Now, whether his tales were true or not, it didn't seem to really matter much. Who the hell really cared? Real life could always use a good story from time to time, and Gerald knew it. He talked about the ranches he worked on back in the day, back in the West, when it was still wide open, you know. He'd talk about the women that he knew with a sheepish grin on his face and a gleam in his eye. He'd tell us about the card games that drained his pockets, but never his spirit. See, old Gerald, he spoke with a kind of worn wisdom about having respect for the law, but absolutely no respect for the men who created the laws. He hated a banker worse than the devil himself. Them bankers, he'd say, spitting like it was a bad taste left in his mouth, they put up all this goddamn wire, ruining the land. Wire fences to Gerald and many people like him were like poison in a well. He never forgave, as he quote, them goddamn bankers for breaking the open land into little pieces and putting a price tag on it. In fact, Gerald wasn't too much for money himself. He lived off the kindness of strangers and the weight of his words. Generosity and good conversation kept him fed and kept him moving right along. In his younger days, he said he rode in rodeos, and he even claimed to have performed for President Grover Cleveland in 1897 when he was just a boy. Now, how old was just a boy in 1897? If you ask him how old he was, he'd scratch his head and squint up at the sun and say something like old enough to know better, but too young enough to even know who Grover Cleveland was. By my reckoning, when I was about 10, Gerald had to be at least 90. And let me tell you, you could see every single one of them years in the lines on his face, the creak in his bones, and in the way he carried himself. He carried himself like a man with nothing to lose and no reason to hurry. You see, old Gerald, he loved the newspaper. Every day he'd pore over it several times a day, grumbling about this or that. But there was a reverence in the way that he spoke about the folks who wrote the paper. To him, they were the keepers of history. These were the ones that told the stories that somehow mattered then and would matter for years to come. They've got this most important job now, he'd say. Since the bankers done ruined everything else, only the people with the words and the pens can protect what little we have left, he said. You see, Gerald believed in the power that words would outlast fences, I guess. And I guess old Gerald had finally given out. Now, see, old Gerald, he had no family, no legacy, not even a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. But he had stories, enough to fill 100 lifetimes. And then one day, they found him lying out there in the sun, still as the land that he loved. I guess old Gerald, like I say, had finally given out. Well, there wasn't no fanfare, there wasn't no big funeral procession, no teary-eyed family clutching to photos of him, nothing like that. I guess you could say old Gerald left the world exactly the way he lived in it. See, old Gerald, he left the world quietly, without a fuss, without asking for a thing. But I think about him every once in a while, especially now when I see what they've done to the Cowboy. Now these days they dress up on cowboy TV shows and streaming platforms and everything else. They wear aviators and designer clothes, and they're all real tough sons of guns. But these boys, these actors and these producers and these people that write these things, they wouldn't know the first thing about being a cowboy. And they wouldn't know the first thing about the cowboy way of life. And these people that wear things like Cowboy Up and these brush popper shirts and drive these pickups and drink their whiskey and all, wear these hats and everything else, they're trying to be something they're really not. They're just trying to fit into a damn shoe that's too small. Well, they make the old cowboys shiny and heroic, I guess. They have all their big speeches and their neatly tied endings. You see, what these people today think of as a cowboy or a man of the West or a man of the Old West or, a cowboy renaissance man, whatever you want to call him. What these people think of these people that they're wanting to be, they're really killing the cowboy. I'm sure Gerald would say the same thing. He'd say they're killing the cowboy just like they already killed the land, selling the image out without even knowing the soul of it. You see, the real cowboy wasn't Yellowstone or 1883, not by a damn long shot. It wasn't glamorous, and if I had to compare it to anything, it'd probably be more like Lonesome Dove or the streets of Laredo. Rough, raw, real, and with more bad days than they had good ones. You see, the land wasn't a backdrop for a drama. It really wasn't. It was a force you reckoned with and you dealt with and you managed every single day. And cowboys like Gerald, they weren't icons. They were just people. They were just regular old people trying to make it through life the best way they knew how. Now, Gerald didn't leave much behind, but he did leave a lot of his stories. And I'll take the tales of an old buzzard like him any day over something slick and polished from Hollywood like what's his name, Tyler, can put out there on one of his streaming platforms and pretend it's a Western. Now, no offense intended to all you folks who like those kind of shows, and no offense to that Tyler fella who makes these stupid shows that make absolutely no sense to me. I don't mean any offense or disrespect, only a polite insult. Because I figure the real cowboys and the real heroes of the West, they didn't need a damn spotlight. No, they lived their life in the dust and in the dirt, real, raw. And people like Larry McMurtry, Louis L'Amour, they wrote the real stories of the cowboy. And they understood that the saddle and the sun and the land were something a little bit more important than making a few bucks on a streaming service. And they were damn proud of it. I'm Matt Pierce. This is the Essays of Texas. Thanks for joining me. Be sure to like, subscribe, follow, and share.